Okay, so chapter 4 is about the study of tissues, which is known as histology. So we're going to see in this chapter the 4 major types of tissues that we have, which are epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. We're going to see some cells within these tissues and their categories of tissues when it comes to connective, which is like the one that has more subtypes of tissues. And then we're going to see the location of the tissues in the body and their function. And we're going to see examples of epithelial tissue like the endocrine glands and exocrine glands, and we're going to compare and contrast their function. We're also going to see where these tissues come from, which is a mesenchyme. This is a type of tissue that exists in embryos. And we're going to find the features of muscle types and also for nervous tissue. So, our body is made up of 4 different tissue types, or come from the cells come from 4 major tissue types. And these tissue types combine to form organs, and the organs, they form organ systems, as you remember. Now, since histology is the study of tissues, then a histologist needs to know how the cells look like. And it needs to know what are the different types of cells, what is perhaps the ratio of nucleus to cytoplasm, etc. So it needs to have deep understanding and knowledge about tissue types. And then when someone has a sample of tissue taken from their body and that person is alive, you call that tissue a biopsy. But if the person has died and then you take a sample, then you call it an autopsy. And then many of these samples are sent, these samples are sent to a pathologist. A pathologist is a doctor who knows really well not only histology, but also knows what happens to these cells when there is a disease. And you can you can diagnose diseases with pathology studies, but also you can predict what can be the consequences besides what the person already has when you see a tissue type. So, for instance, you can kind of see tissue types that perhaps can become cancerous. In this case will be dysplasia, which is the precursor of cancer, and then you can report that. So, what is the importance of histology? Well, we all have tissue in our body. And this tissue is organized in a particular way in the different organs and is located in that area for a reason, to perform a function. So then, it is important to understand the normal way the tissues are and where they are located, to know perhaps when a tissue is in another place in the body where it shouldn't be. In that case, you call it ectopic. Or you can see changes based on either physiology or maybe a disease. Like, not all the changes that happens in our cells are related to a disease. What if someone starts working out their muscles? What is the organelle that is going to increase normally in number in the muscle cells? Of course, the mitochondria, right? Because the mitochondria is the one that generates ATP. So in that case, that muscle type will increase the number of mitochondria. So then it's important to understand the function of the tissues, their location, and that will bridge the gap between cellular biology and organ system physiology. So partly I mentioned last time about where does the mitochondria comes from. Mitochondria come from our mother. Our mother inherited us the mitochondria. And then we said, like, if we have a mitochondrial disease, well, that comes from the lineage from our mom. And what can be the consequences? The person will be fatigued because it doesn't produce enough ATP. So see how you bridge a cellular event to an organismal event. The person will be fatigued because it has problems with the mitochondria. And that's an organelle, it's not even a cell. A tiny organelle can lead to huge consequences. And not only that, but also, if you remember what I mentioned, and someone in the future will ask you, well, I have this family member, or maybe it's the person itself tells you, well, you know what, I have problem. I have inherited problem with the mitochondria, or a problem with the mitochondria, or you know the name, and they ask you, oh, well, whose defective genes are, and you can tell, well, it comes from the mother. So, and if they ask you who was your A&P teacher, then you can tell who he was. Okay, so the cells are not floating in the space. So they are hauled into a particular area. And that particular area is called the extracellular matrix. So in the extracellular matrix, that space, we have ground substance, which in this case is going to be made by these peptidoglycan aggregates, which is a protein with a carbohydrate attached to them. And this peptidoglycan that you can see, it has like this middle strand, and then it has some lateral protrusions where you have these proteins and these glycans that helps to absorb water. So it helps to hydrate the tissues, this peptidoglycan. Now, something else that you have, it is the protein fibers. So this is collagen. Collagen is the thicker protein that we have in the extracellular matrix and in many tissues. And we have different types of collagen, but this is like the most strong, thicker protein that we have. And then also, we have other proteins that are less thicker than the collagen, and these are called reticular fibers. And reticular fibers, just as collagen, they run randomly. But something about these reticular fibers is that in tissues, for instance, like the spleen, which is located here in the left upper quadrant, I was doing, that's here. So that spleen forms a net with the reticular fibers. And with this net, it traps all erythrocytes. So reticular fibers, when they're abundant in certain tissues, form a net. And then we have other proteins that are much thinner than the reticular fibers, which will be the elastic fibers. And the elastic fibers, they can stretch, and then they can recoil. So that's why they are elastic. It's like a rubber band. And that provides elasticity to many tissues in our body, including the skin. So the skin is supposed to, like if you pull it, it's supposed to retract and then stay in a particular way. As we age, these elastic fibers get lost. And then if it's the ones in the joints, then every time that we bend, it's harder for us because we don't have as much elasticity. And then wrinkles appears because of this lack of elastic fibers. So those are things that happens as we age. So then all of these components that you see here are the extracellular matrix. How do I know? Well, because here is your plasma membrane, and then your integral proteins, this is the cytosol. So everything here is inside the cell, everything on top is outside the cells. For epithelial cells to be hauled into other cells, we have cell junctions or connections. We have different types, like this one in between the two cells. These will be the tight junctions. It's not shown in here, but underneath we have cadherence junctions. And these junctions helps to maintain the cells in its place. And then we have desmosomes here. And this is the lateral side of the cells. So this is the basal side. We have hemidesmosomes are not shown in here, but we have hemidesmosomes here in the basal side. And not all the cells, but some cells have additional junctions, like gap junctions. These gap junctions will be found in electrically excitable cells, like cardiac muscle cells and some neurons. So, if you magnify each of these junctions, you can see that the tight junctions keep these two plasma membranes from the cells very close. So that's why they're tight junctions. So it's like a seal. And then these hemidesmosomes, they have integral linker proteins, and then they have intermediate filaments. They look like discs. These are abundant in skin cells together with the hemidesmosomes. The other one, the tight junctions, are abundant in our intestinal cells because the nutrients that we ingest, you want them to go forcibly through the apical side into the cells. You don't want them to go in between the cells. So that's why we have a lot of tight junctions there. And then gap junctions, we have them a lot in the heart muscle cells. And then these gap junctions are called gap because there is actually a channel in between the cells. Through these channels, ions crosses like calcium, sodium, potassium, and also electrical current, so that the cells can keep the same levels of each of these items. It's like the little window of the drive-through. So they give you some food when you purchase food to these restaurants. In these restaurants, sorry. Any questions about the junctions? Okay, so 4 primary tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. And each of these are distinct. So remember when we saw in the previous chapter this slide with a muscle cell and a neuron and a cuboidal cell? Well, these cells, they have that particular shape for a function. Remember the principle in anatomy and physiology, structure, function. So we will see then why these cells are the way they are and what is their function. So let's look at the characteristics of the first tissue type, which is epithelial tissue. So in epithelial tissue, we have sheets of cells protecting internal and external surfaces in our body, like the skin. The skin is an epithelium. The inside of our mouth is an epithelium. The inside of the urinary tract is an epithelium. So we have cells, so that's cellularity, and the cells are oriented properly, that is polarity. It's not related to voltage. In this case, it's orientation. So the basal side of the cells faces the basal membrane, while the apical side faces the environment, and then you have sides of the cells, which we call lateral sides, or lateral. So the basement membrane in epithelia can be considered like a mat in the floor. And your feet will be the basal side. And then Your head will be the apical side, and then your arms will be lateral. So your feet, if you're walking, of course, will be always on the ground. So that will be the basal side always faces the basement membrane. There is no way that you can walk with your head. So the apical side is never toward the floor. So it's always facing the environment. So that's the polarity, okay? And then a characteristic of epithelial tissue is that it's avascular. So what does that means? So it means that you don't have blood vessels, hence you don't have blood supply. So then how cells can receive nutrients, hormones, water, ions without blood supply? Well, in this case will be through diffusion. Epithelial tissue underneath has other tissues that has blood supply. They are vascular. So then the vascular tissues underneath the epithelial tissue provide oxygen, nutrients to the avascular tissue, which will be the epithelial tissue. And then something that is highly characteristic of epithelial tissue is that it's highly regenerative. So that means that it can repair and replace really quickly. When someone has cancer, guys, and the person receives chemotherapy, oftentimes or most of the times, the hair fall off, and then the person has problems, gastrointestinal problems like diarrhea. Why? Because chemotherapy targets cells that are constantly dividing, and the hair cells and the intestinal cells constantly divide. So that's why people lose their hair. So it's part of a secondary effect of the drugs. So now you understand why. Because chemotherapy not only attacks cancer cells, which are rapidly dividing, but also normal cells that are rapidly dividing. Okay? So classification of epithelial tissue by layers. It can be simple or stratified. I see some people here in their clothing, the top, that they are simple. They have only one. And then some of us, we are stratified. More than one layer. Okay? So that's the first classification. Second is by the shape of the cells. If the shape of the cells is flat, you call it squamous, like a scale from fish scales, flat. So that's squamous. If the cells are square-like, they will be cuboidal. And if the cells are taller than wider, they will be columnar. And if the shape changes from one to another, in this case from cuboidal to squamous, that will be transitional. And where do we have this type of epithelium where you change from one epithelium to another? Will be in the urinary bladder and also ureters that carries the urine from the urinary bladder, from the kidneys to the urinary bladder, and also in the urethra. Urinary bladder, if it's full, Your epithelium is going to squish, so it's going to be squamous. And then once you empty it, it's going to be square-like, cuboidal. And then pseudostratified is falsely stratified. So it has only one layer, but it looks more than one. So, examples of these tissue types and where they are located. Simple squamous, we have it in the lungs. In the deep part of our lungs, we have little chambers that are called, or spaces that we call alveoli. In these alveoli, we have gas exchange. So oxygen comes in, CO2 goes out. And we have to have simple squamous epithelium because we have to have rapid gas exchange. Imagine if we had their columnar cells and if we had more than one layer, like a stratified columnar. Ooh, the oxygen, it will take forever to go into our body, and the CO2 will stay forever in our body, so we'll be all bluish. So areas where you have to have rapid diffusion, that's where you have simple epithelium and squamous. Crazy idea. You're going to go on a date. You like so much the person. And you have a good perfume. Well, you don't put the perfume and wear a bunch of layers, right? You only wear one. Why? Because you want the diffusion. That would be simple one. But don't put it very transparent, but it will be squamous, very thin. Okay, next epithelium, simple cuboidal, you got it. Why is that? So in this case, you have only one layer of cells that are specialized for secretion and absorption. Kidney tubules is an example. So since you want to secrete, you want to actually be able as well to have a space to accumulate items to secrete them. So that's why it's cuboidal, that's why it's not squamous. And then since you want to absorb, also you want to have certain space to absorb, and more or less you don't want to absorb really rapidly, but more rapidly than having columnar. So that's why we have simple cuboidal in the kidney tubules, because that's where we get rid of items and then we absorb items that we require. It's like the filter of our body. And then simple columnar for absorption and secretion, digestive tract. Is the same as simple cuboidal, the same function. But why we have them columnar? Well, because you have more volume, and that allows you to absorb more. And not only that, but since you have transit of food, that sometimes the food can be mechanically abrasive because it's solid food or semi-solid. In that case, if you don't have these tall cells to protect, then your epithelium will be eroded really easily. So then, next epithelium, stratified squamous for protection. We have in the skin and the mouth. So we have several layers of squamous cells on top of each other, forming our skin. And in this case, it makes sense because we manipulate the environment with the skin. So, or well, not with the skin, but We touch objects, wrap objects, and when we walk, if you walk barefoot, of course, you need protection. So you have extra layers of cells. And then, how thick will be our skin, guys? If we didn't have squamous epithelium, we had cuboidal, and if we have columnar, which will be worse? Imagine several layers of cells, and then will be columnar. Our skin will be very, very thick, right? So that's why we have stratified squamous. And same for our mouth. And then we already explained about this transitional. It just changes from cuboidal to squamous. So the cells become flat as the volume increases, at least in the urinary bladder. So major characteristics of epithelial tissue is that the cells are tightly packed. Again, they are polar, they have polarity, and not talking about the charge, electrical charge, vascular, and they face basement membrane. Now, for the other tissue types, like connective tissue, you have abundant extracellular matrix, so a lot of fibers, like peptidoglycan, no, not peptidoglycan, that proteoglycan, and then some cells, and those cells are different. So we will see the classification of each of these tissue types or connective tissue types. And then muscle tissue is specialized for contraction. It's excitable. You need to have a neuron that helps for the muscle to contract, because that neuron is going to release a chemical that we call neurotransmitter, so that the muscle can contract. And then we have nervous tissue, in which you have excitable neurons, and then you have supporting cells, which will be called glial cells. When we start looking at the nervous tissue, you will see what are the different types of glial cells and what is their function. So here is the epithelial tissue. So you have this apical surface, this basal surface, and this lateral surface. And these are the tight junctions. Here's the nucleus, desmosomes, and the basement membrane, which has a basal lamina, which is the one that is close to this epithelium, and the reticular lamina, which has a lot of elastic fibers that faces this connective tissue underneath. You don't see any blood vessels here, but you see them here in this underlying connective tissue. So this tissue is avascular, while this tissue is vascular. Now, what type of epithelium is that? What is the name? Look at the number of layers of cells and look at the shape of the cells. So how would you call it? Simple columnar, very good. Cells are taller, then wider, and you only have one layer of cells. So it's simple columnar. And then here we have simple squamous epithelium. This one will be pseudostratified. It's simple columnar, but the cells, since they are like in this direction, sometimes they are not perfectly straight like this, so they can go one over the other. When you make the cut and you see it, it looks like if you have more than one layer of cells. So this can be like 1, 2, 3 layers, but no, it's only one. Pseudo means false. And then this is a stratified epithelium. It's a squamous, so the cells look like this. And this is a cuboidal cell, this is columnar. So actual samples. So here is the lung tissue. Specifically will be the membrane that covers the lungs. So if you magnify the pleura, you will see this simple squamous epithelium. On the left is a cartoon, on the right it's an actual light microscopy view. So here it is the epithelium itself. This is the basement membrane, and this is the underlying connective tissue. So that's simple squamous. Simple cuboidal. So here is a magnification of the kidneys, the tubules. So it's like a cross section. What is a cross section? It's not like this, it's like this. So it is like if you were looking at this part. So in that cross section, what you can see, it is only one layer of cells here, and they are cuboidal. This space between the cells in tubules is called lumen, L-U-M-E-N. Then simple columnar, only one layer of cells. This is the nucleus, large nucleus. This is the apical side, this is the basal side. So here you have the basement membrane, and underneath the basement membrane you have connective tissue. Where do we have this simple columnar epithelium? In the pancreatic duct. The pancreas is an organ that we have in the abdominal cavity that produces hormones like insulin that helps to drop the blood glucose levels, and also help us to digest our food because it produces enzymes that breaks down the food. So we have a duct inside the pancreas that it has this simple columnar epithelium. Pseudostratified, we have it in the upper respiratory tract, specifically in the trachea. So you have only one layer of cells, it looks more than one, and this epithelium has in its surface cilia. This cilia helps to sweep away mucus that we produce to lubricate our trachea, and also to sweep away any debris that we might breathe. So it's like a protective mechanism having this cilia. So it sweeps away these items that can go into the lower respiratory tract. And then in between these cells, we have, this is the epithelium, we have these cells that are called globet, or mucus, it's goblet cells, not globet, it's goblet cells. These goblet cells produces mucus. So this is mucus inside these goblet cells, and then they send this mucus into the surface of the cilia so that the cells will be protected. So this cilia is constantly sweeping. If you're a smoker, your poor cilia is like this. It's all paralyzed. So with time and with years, people develop what is called a smoker's cough, in which you hear them coughing and they have mucus. You can hear them. It's productive cough. That's how it's called. It's not dry cough. Nicotine affects the cilia. So what is the function of the junctions? We already saw that. So tight junctions seal spaces between the cells to prevent leakage. Desmosomes anchor the cells together to resist mechanical stress. Again, the desmosomes are abundant in the skin cells because that's where we have a lot of mechanical stress. And gap junctions allow the passage of small molecules and allow cell communication. So what is the epithelium transport? So it's the transport of molecules either in between the cells, which we will call it paracellular transport, or it can be transcellular transport. So it goes from apical to cytoplasm and then to basal. And then any molecule that passes in between the cells is called a pericellular transport cell or molecule. Well, when it goes in this direction, from apical membrane to cytoplasm to basement membrane, that will be transcellular, through. Okay, now let's look at another example of epithelium, stratified squamous. When it comes to stratified squamous, you can have two types, with keratin and without keratin. We have epithelium stratified squamous with keratin in areas of the body that are subject to more abrasion, like our skin, our anterior gums, and also the roof of our mouth. And where do we have stratified squamous epithelium without keratin? In areas where you have abrasion, but it's less than the skin or the mouth. Like for instance, in females, the vagina, we have a stratified squamous epithelium, so several layers of cells without keratin. And this is the basement membrane. These are the basal cells. The cells that are closer to the basement membrane are called the basal cells. And these will be the most apical cells, and we don't have keratin in this area. Now, this is the type of epithelium during reproductive stage. Females during extremes of life, like during childhood or elderly years, this epithelium will be cuboidal, because that's where you don't expect females to have sexual intercourse. But during reproductive years, since sexual intercourse happens, then you have to have most protective epithelium, which is stratified squamous, but without keratin. Now, where else do we have this type of epithelium? We have it in the esophagus. The esophagus is the tube that brings the food from the mouth into the stomach. So that's where we have this type of epithelium. The stratified cuboidal epithelium, we have it in sweat gland ducts. So this is a sweat gland. If you magnify the duct, this is how you will look at. So 1, 2, 3, almost 4 layers of cells. So this is a stratified cuboidal. All of these are square-like cells. Sweat glands produces sweat. They're located in our skin. Stratified columnar epithelium. We have it in the salivary gland ducts, like this. In this case, this will be the parotid gland. The parotid gland is a large gland that we have here on the sides of our jaw, and it produces saliva. So in this case, we have 1 layer, 2 layers of columnar cells. That's why it's stratified columnar. Transitional epithelium. Again, we have it in the urinary system, like urinary bladder, ureters, urethra. The one where it changes the most will be in the urinary bladder, because that's where we store the urine. However, in the ureter, as it's transferring the urine from the kidneys into a urinary bladder, or the urethra from the urinary bladder to the outside of the body, when you are transiting, when you are moving the urine from those areas, that's when the cells become squished, they become squamous, and then once you stop transferring the urine, then they become again cuboidal. And this is how it looks like. And then we are talking about changes in this apical layer. So it's a stratified epithelium for sure, but this layer is the one that changes its shape. So you cannot see the transition because this is not a live video of a urinary bladder as it's getting full or empty. But this is a standstill picture. Now, if you look at the cells here on the top, the most apical cells, looking in here in the cartoon and the actual microscopy view, what would you say about this urinary bladder? Was it full or empty. Not all at once. Empty. Why? Because the cells are cuboidal. Very good. And I know that many of you knew the answer, but say it. Come on. No one's going to bite you. Okay, now let's look at the difference between endocrine and exocrine glands. So these glands come from epithelial cells. Actually, the mammary gland is part of the epithelium. So we consider it as part of the reproductive system, but it is actual epithelium. So exocrine glands secrete the products into the surface of our body, like the sweat glands are exocrine because they release the sweat into the surface of our skin. Endocrine glands, they release hormones into the bloodstream, so they go into the blood vessels. And while exocrine glands exert a local effect, endocrine glands produce a systemic effect. Systemic means throughout the body. And then for hexocrine glands, we have different secretions. Merocrine through exocytosis, holocrine, which the cells rupture completely, and apocrine when you have only pinching of the cytoplasm. So only a fragment, it is released with the apocrine. So merocrine is through, again, exocytosis. Rupture will be holocrine secretion, and then when the cytoplasm pinches off will be apocrine. So glands can be classified then as, if they're exocrine, as merocrine, apocrine, or holocrine. So here is an example of glands derived from the epithelial tissue. So this is simple columnar epithelial cells, and this is a goblet cell that is going to release this mucus. So this is an unicellular gland. So these are the droplets of the mucus. And the release is through exocytosis. So this is a merocrine gland. It's not pinching off, so it's not apocrine, and it's not rupturing, so it's not holocrine. Okay? So the glands can be also classified based on the structure. How do they look? Like, for instance, exocrine glands that are multicellular, in this case you have these cells here on the edge, like they form this little narrowing portion that it's a duct, so it's like a cut, like this, so you can see internally. So it's a frontal cut. So in this case, this will be the duct. And then this part, which is the secretory part, will be called a tubule if it has a shape like this, or it can be called an acini if it has a round shape. And it can be tubuloacinar if it has both the shape of a tubule combined with the shape of an acini. It's not perfectly round, but it's not as narrow as if it was a tubule. So that's based on the cluster shapes. Now, based on the duct structures, some glands only has one duct without branches, so this will be called simple. But sometimes the duct can branch, and this is called compound. And then you can combine then the duct cell structure name with the secretory portion name. So in this case, this will be simple tubular. Why? Because you only have one tubule. You only have one duct, and then the ending is a tubule. And in this case will be simple acinar, because you only have one duct, and the ending is round. And in this case will be compound acinar, because this duct splits. And then acinar, because the endings are round. And then you can have compound tubuloacinar, in which you have multiple ducts with some endings, or the secretory portion that looks like tubules, and some that looks like a round part, like an acinar. So you can mix and match the names. That's similar to the epithelium when it comes to the glands. So let's look at some examples of secretion types. So here we have the secretory portion of the epithelium. And since in this case the products are being released by exocytosis, this will be merocrine secretion. So you have vesicles here with the product. And then when you bring them close to the plasma membrane, you extrude them, that's exocytosis, so this is a merocrine gland. Now, in this case, we have these cells that has these products that are accumulating in these secretory cells, and then they are shed and rupturing these cells. So this is a holocrine. And then once these cells are ruptured and release their secretions, you replace them by mitosis. So you don't leave a gap. So this is holocrine versus merocrine. Now, those were all the characteristics of epithelial tissue, including glands and their mode of secretion. Any questions? Now let's move then into connective tissue. In connective tissue, we have again abundant extracellular matrix for the most part, and the cells scattered within this extracellular matrix. So here we have cells that makes the connective tissue: fibroblasts, adipocytes, mast cells, and macrophages. And this is how each of these look like. So these are fibroblasts here embedded within this extracellular matrix. So they have a nucleus, they have sometimes these elongated shapes, or they can have kind of this round shape, and this will be the cytoplasm. So the dark spot there in the middle, purple, that will be the nucleus. The clear surrounding will be the cytoplasm. So fibroblasts makes collagen fibers, reticular fibers, and elastic fibers in the connective tissue. And then here we have the adipocytes. In this case, the adipocytes takes like a signet ring shape, in which the nucleus goes to one end, like into the periphery, and this clear area is the cytoplasm. Adipocytes in their cytoplasm has fatty tissue, fatty acids, triglycerides. So they are the storage for triglycerides. And then the mast cells, they have a large nucleus and granules that has inflammatory mediators that are going to produce inflammation when they are released. And then here we have a macrophage, an activated macrophage. So it's a gigantic cell with several extensions that we call pulse feet or pseudopods. With this false fit, they can engulf particles that they can encounter or cells like in the case of bacteria. So they help to eat up bacteria. So those are the cells then of the connective tissue. Now let's look at where not only connective tissue, but most of the tissues in our body come from. Most of the tissues in our body, guys, come from mesenchyme. Mesenchyme means specialized embryonic connective tissue that is softer, but out of this we have the mesenchymal cells that are very primitive, but they are going to, with time, differentiate to give the different tissue types that we have. So they contain genetic instructions coming from the maternal side that it helps them to differentiate. So it serves as an origin, these mesenchymal cells, to the diverse connective tissue types. Now, what are the structural characteristics of connective tissue? Well, the cells are scattered in an extensive extracellular matrix. You may have seen video lectures on YouTube from other places, other universities. And you might have seen a snapshot of the room where the students are in this room. And you might have seen that there is no seats available. So for us, very few students, very few cells, and a lot of seats available. So that's the extracellular matrix. While you are the cells of the connective tissue. Very few cells and abundant connective tissue. That's for the most part. That's characteristic of this connective tissue. Another characteristic is that in the extracellular matrix, you have ground substance, proteoglycan, and then you have these collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular. And no matter what type of connective tissue you are considering, they share the following functions. Will be support, protection, and transport. That's the function of connective tissue: support, protection, and transport. Now let's look at how connective tissue is classified and the places where it's located. So we have loose connective tissue, which is areolar, adipose tissue, and reticular. Loose connective tissue, it is areolar, adipose, and reticular. We have all these three types in our skin, for instance. It's an example, but we have it in many places. Dense connective tissue. It can be classified as regular, irregular, and elastic. We have it as well in the skin, but we also have it in the tendons that connects bones to muscles, or muscles to bones, and ligaments. And then we have specialized connective tissues like cartilage, bone, and blood. Blood is the only fluid connective tissue that we have in our body. No other tissue in our body is fluid except for the blood. And then example of where the blood is located, well, it's located in the blood vessels. Bone is located in the skeleton, and cartilage also is located in the skeleton, as well in other places like our nose, our ears, our trachea. So let's look at images of this connective tissue. Tomorrow during the lab, we're going to start looking at slides of tissue types. So here is loose connective tissue. So this is a piece of skin. So this is superficial skin. This is deep layer of the skin. So if you magnify it, you will see these fibroblasts. All of these are fibroblasts. And this is, the space is called the ground substance. That's where we have the proteoglycans. And then here we have elastic fibers, thick collagen fibers. That's all in our skin. Any questions? And this is like the deep layer of our skin, in the dermis. That's the name. We will see more characteristics of this in the next chapter. And now, here, more deeper in our skin, we have this dense irregular connective tissue. So again, this is a piece of skin, so this is superficial layer of the skin. This is the deep layer of the skin. This is loose connective tissue. And the deepest layer of our skin is dense irregular connective tissue. So what do we have in this dense irregular connective tissue? So we have collagen fibers, and then we have these fibroblasts here. But look at the orientation of these collagen fibers. It's so irregular. That's why it's irregular. And then why you call it dense? Well, because the collagen fibers are thicker than this. This is very thin collagen fibers in comparison to this. So they're denser. So it's dense irregular connective tissue in the deepest layer of our skin. And it would be thick skin in this case, the sample. Now, in our ligaments and tendons, like this is the view of a cadaver hand, like if you magnify one piece of it, in this tendon of the fingers, or well, the metatarsal area, metacarpal, sorry. So if you magnify, you can see a lot of collagen fibers. These are the fibroblasts. And these collagen fibers, within the orientation level, they are regularly oriented. So they follow the same direction. So this is dense regular connective tissue. It is dense because the collagen fibers are thick, and it's regular because they follow the same direction. Then we have in our aorta, which is the largest artery that we have in our body, we have it starting in the thorax, goes up to the abdomen, the aorta. We have dense, regular, elastic connective tissue. So here is the heart, here is the aorta, the aorta connects to the heart. Again, this is an artery. And if you magnify a piece of the aorta and you see it under the microscope, you will be able to see abundant elastic fibers. And the elastic fibers are thick in comparison to the ones that we saw in the skin before. So that's why this is called dense, regular, elastic connective tissue. Now, it's not, don't expect that because you hear the word regular, like the fibers going to go perfectly straight. In this case, look at the orientation of the fibers. They go up and down like if it was a wave. But more or less, they follow the same pattern. That's why it's regular. I know that sometimes in some places when a group of people is dancing and they play country songs, they start like a group of people, 8 to 12 or more, depending. They start doing square dance. And there's always one of the people who don't follow the way they dance. just because of that person, you call it irregular dance? No, it's more regular than irregular, right? So in this case, I mean, yeah, it looks a little bit kind of out of orientation, but still is regular. It has a pattern, so that's why it's called dense, regular, elastic, connective tissue. Okay, and it's elastic fibers. Reticular tissue. In this case, it's a lymph node, but we have it also in the spleen and in the liver. So if you magnify a piece of a lymph node, which is part of the lymphatic system, so in our body, guys, in different areas, like for instance in our neck, in our back of our knee, in our groin, we have lymph nodes that protect us from infection and from cancer. So if you magnify one of these pieces of the lymph node, this is a frontal section or longitudinal section, you will be able to see these reticular fibers. And these reticular fibers form a net that in this case, they form a support system for these leukocytes, these white blood cells. Specifically, they're going to be lymphocytes. So that these lymphocytes, as a fluid in our body is called the lymph passes through, this fluid can be cleared out of cancer cells and bacteria or microorganisms that the lymph may have. So then here are the reticular fibers, these are the lymphocytes, and these will be the fibroblasts. For adipose tissue, we have it in areas in our body like underneath our skin. This is called subcutaneous tissue. In this case, this is the lateral view of a cadaver. So this will be what it was, the love handle, for instance. So if you magnify a piece of this adipose tissue, you will see all of these adipocytes. So these are individual cells. This is the nucleus of these adipocytes. And inside you have the lipid inclusion. So this is lipids. Functions is to protect our body, to cushion, to insulate our body, and to store energy. Hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is a type of cartilage. It's a type of connective tissue. Cartilage that is hyaline is a precursor of bone. So bone, most of our bones in our body come from cartilage. And cartilage has cells that are called the chondrocytes. So these are the chondrocytes. And the chondrocytes are located in spaces that we call lacunae. Lacunae for little lake, or laguna for lake. And this tissue, which is softer than bone, it is located in the fetal skeleton. Mostly everywhere is going to form, again, most of our bones in our body. But then we will keep that type of bone, of cartilage in certain areas of our body, like the area that connects our ribs to the sternum, like at the endings of our bones, and also at the tip of our nose. So if you touch the tip of our nose, press it a little bit with your index, you will feel the consistency of this hyaline cartilage. That's how it feels like. It's not hard as bone, but it's not very soft. So that's hyaline cartilage. And then other areas where we have it is in the trachea. And all of these purple color that you see, this tissue surrounding these chondrocytes, this will be the extracellular matrix. They abbreviate ECM as extracellular matrix in your images. And again, we have it many places in our body, this hyaline cartilage. Fibrocartilage, it's a stronger cartilage than the hyaline. And we have it in a particular area of our body, or particular areas of our body, like in between the bones in the spinal column. So this will be what we call the intervertebral discs. And since the spinal column helps to transfer the weight of our body into the lower limbs, we have to have a strong cartilage in between these bones so that when you have bone-to-bone contact, well, you prevent bone-to-bone contact by having this pad of cartilage that is called the intervertebral disc. So this is how it looks under the microscope. You have a lot of fibers in the extracellular matrix, collagen bundles, and then you have few chondrocytes in the lacunae. So you have more fibers than cells. So that's why it's called fibrocartilage. Elastic cartilage is a type of cartilage that we have in areas where you need elasticity, like in the glottis, the epiglottis. The epiglottis, it's a little flap-like cartilage that we have on top of the larynx. The larynx is our voice box. So when someone is eating or drinking, the epiglottis covers the larynx so that the food or the liquid doesn't go into your airways. So that goes into your digestive system because you close the larynx with this epiglottis. So this epiglottis, when we are about to breathe or speak, opens so that the air can come out or in. So then this epiglottis do this. So it's constantly doing this. So that's why you have to have elastic cartilage. Another area where we have elastic cartilage, where you can actually feel like how it feels, is your ears. If you bend over your ears anteriorly and you release it, it's supposed to go back. So that's elastic cartilage. And then feel the difference between the hyaline cartilage that you have at the tip of the nose to the elastic. Okay? So now, if you look at the elastic cartilage in the microscope, so you have abundant chondrocytes, and then these are the lacunae, and then you have elastic fibers that allows this recoiling after you bend over a structure. Bone. Bone is the third hardest tissue in our body. First is the mammal, second is dentin, third is bone. Bone is calcified connective tissue. And again, most bones come from hyaline cartilage. Others come from a membrane, like the skull bones. But then the bones have cells that are called the osteocytes. They have also cells that we call osteoclasts, and they have cells that are called the osteoblasts. And this is a cross-section of bone tissue showing you the unit of bone that is called the osteon, in which you have a central gap that is called the central canal, and then you have calcified matrix, which will be this. These are called concentric lamellae. And in between these concentric lamellae, you have these osteocytes in the lacunae. So when hyaline cartilage ossifies, become bone, or calcifies, become bone. So here is the bone extracellular matrix. These are the osteocytes in the lacunae. These are the osteoblasts, and these are the osteoclasts in the membrane that covers the bone that is called the periosteum. When we start looking at the bone chapter, you will see more details of this. And then blood, the only fluid connective tissue. Blood cells are made in the bone marrow. And then we have two major types of blood cells. We have red blood cells, which are the most abundant, which are these. They look like a disc. They don't have a nucleus. These are the only cells that they don't have a nucleus. They pick up oxygen, bring it into our tissues, and then from the tissue they pick up CO2, and then bring it into our lungs so that we can get rid of the CO2. And then Since we have a lot of metabolism, we require more red blood cells than white blood cells. White blood cells have a nucleus, which will be these ones, these cells. And these cells are larger than the white blood cells. And the function in general of white blood cells is to protect us against infections. Since most of us, we are not having an infection all the time, it makes sense that we have less white blood cells than red blood cells. Okay? And then we have fragments of cells that are called the megakaryocytes. Of cells that are called the megakaryocytes that are called platelets. Platelets prevents bleeding. And all of these three form elements, white blood cells, red blood cells, and the platelets, are floating in a fluid that is called the plasma. Okay, so that's all for connective tissue. We will stop there and we will continue with